Hope everyone is doing well. We are currently in the text that we're using, the book, The Theory and Practice of Universal Ethics, the Noahide Laws, by Rabbi Dr. Shimon Dovid Cowen of Australia. Page 164, for those of you that have a copy and are able to follow inside. We're in the second section of the book, the practical parts, as opposed to the philosophical or theoretical part of it. We're in chapter 6. As I said, page 164, and we will, with Hashem's help, definitely finish this chapter. All right. Very timely as we are getting ready, and the reason why we're not having class next week is because it is the second day of Shavuos, the day that the Jewish nation received the Torah, and of course, we were given the mandate to get the entire world to keep their 7 universal divine Noahide commandments with all that they entail. And this is what our class is all about. We're sort of in the middle of discussing, since the beginning of the chapter, the two schools of thought within the codifiers of Jewish law. And without reviewing everything, just giving a quick, brief review. One approach is that anything which is not part of the 7, but it's a rational part of the Torah, a rational law, such as all the civil laws, things between one Jew and another Jew in the rational realm, as opposed to things between the Jew or the man and his creator, unless there is a clear exemption, it should apply to all the Noahides as well. And that would all fall under the category, basically, of dinim, of mishpatim, of the so to say 7th of the Noahide commandments, to govern and to establish courts of law to uphold the 6. Included are all of those laws. So really, the nations of the world, when making their laws, should not need to reinvent the wheel. They should simply, so to say, look into the Torah and where these laws are to be found all over the place. Of course, one of the main places would be in the book of Exodus, in the Torah portion of Mishpatim, which is like chapter 20, 25, 26, 27, around that. And in the book of Devarim, in the parsha of Kiseitse, and spread out in other places as well. And to know practically what to do, so then besides the Talmud, fast forward, the Jewish code of law, the Shulchan Aruch. So to use the section in the Shulchan Aruch, out of the 4 sections, which would be called Choshen Mishpat. That is the section which deals with these types of civil laws, etc. And that's what they need to follow. Again, except for where it's clearly, for whatever reason, we may not have the reason. It may just be that this is a divine decree, but it applies to the Jews only. That's one approach. The other approach is that, no, all of those things would be suggestions. They're not part of the 7. Therefore, they're not mandatory and obligatory. And therefore, when the Noahides are establishing a community and making a governing body and a court of law with judges, etc., they need not follow the Torah laws for those types of laws as well, but they can. But what everyone does agree with is that at the very least, based on the verse, so to say, the spirit of the law, based on the verse in Isaiah that this world was not created to be chaotic, but rather to be settled and run properly. Therefore, that includes a lot of other things that are not part of the 7, such as honoring parents, giving charity, education, etc. All right. That was a very brief review, and now let us continue inside. The conditions of ascending rationality. A number of considerations operate in allowing the adoption of additional requirements or stringencies in Noahide law. The first is that these not conflict with the basic body of Noahide law itself. And we'll explain. The patriarch Jacob, before Sinai, living by Noahide law, was prophetically aware of the commandments which would in the future be given to the Jewish people at Sinai, or to the Bnei Yisrael, which literally means the children of Israel. Who's Israel? He's the original Israel. Jacob later on had his name changed, as you're aware, so he had another name called Israel. So there is no children of Israel yet. He is Israel, but he knew what was going to be given at Sinai. He also kept them. He kept them. Or as we say, and let's not get practical because then we need to explain more. So let's just keep it completely theoretical, if you will. Jacob kept all 613 of the future commandments. And even more than that, it actually says that he kept all the rabbinic decrees and commandments as well. Whatever that means. Let's leave it at that for now. An exception was the Jewish prohibition on marrying 2 sisters in a time at which polygamy is permitted. He, in fact, did marry 2 sisters. Now, over here, Rabbi Cowen is going to very, very briefly give us the punchline. And as he references in footnote 75 on the next page, Likutei Sichos, volume 5, the truth is that Likutei Sichos, the talks of the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach, the edited official talks, in that particular essay in volume 5, he addresses this question. And it's an old question that has been asked by the commentaries centuries ago. How was Jacob allowed to marry 2 sisters if we know that part of our midrashic oral tradition is that he, just as his father and grandfather, kept all the commandments? So how could he marry 2 sisters? In that particular essay, the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach brings down what the commentaries explain and answer, various different explanations, and for the most part, we rejects them, and then explains his novel explanation. And so it's really a whole essay, but really we're just going to get the gist of it, the bottom line, so to say, punchline of that talk. Just want you to have an appreciation of what he's doing over here. Okay. So, how could Jacob marry 2 sisters? That's exactly the point we're trying to make over here. He, in fact, did marry 2 sisters. This is because he had, here's the key word, promised to marry Rachel, the second and younger sister. When he found that he had been deceived into marrying her sister Leah first, he kept his promise to her by taking her as a second wife. Obviously, a lot needs to be explained, but that's the bottom line. Meaning, well, let's just finish the paragraph. Had he kept the Jewish commandment in which before Sinai he was not then basically obligated, it was what we call Einoi Mitzuveh ve'oiseh, not commanded. It was voluntarily kept, as opposed to an outright commandment. So he kept all the 613 because he chose to do so. So had he kept this commandment of the prohibition against being married to two sisters, he would have violated a basic Noahide injunction to keep one's word. Now, you can ask which one of the seven is keeping your word. So that's a whole discussion there as well. Basically, by that point, the Noahides accepted upon themselves not to lie and not to be deceitful, which is it's pretty funny because the biggest crook at the time there in this whole story was the one who deceived Yaakov, his own uncle and father-in-law. But that doesn't matter. When you're dealing with someone who is unfair or not just in business, that does not give one a license to act in the same way. So don't do business with him, stay away from him. But just because you're dealing with someone crooked, that doesn't mean that you are allowed to be deceitful as well. And practically speaking, at times that may end up being difficult, because how do you deal with someone who's a swindler? It's a problem. Try to avoid dealing with such people. Go make your money in a different, better, honest way, even if it's not as much money. Anyhow, so the Noahides at that point already took upon themselves, it was common practice for all of the Noahides not to be deceitful. That can go as part of the category of not stealing, because there's a concept of deceiving someone, just like we know even today, the whole copyright business and that whole thing of information or intelligence. Can you steal someone else's? It's not tangible physical property, but it's their property. So arguably one can say that deceiving someone is a form of stealing. In Jewish law, it surely is. It's called genevas das. That's the term. Genevas das means stealing of one's knowledge or awareness. So to deceive someone, just to give them the wrong impression, even though I'm not taking anything of theirs, but just to lead them on and give them the wrong impression without saying an outright lie, for a Jew, in most cases, as generalization, is forbidden. So therefore, because he promised the one who he really wanted to marry, the younger of the two sisters, Rachel, that he would marry her, he gave his word. So now that's a commitment. And he told her father, his uncle, and Lavan, or Laban, however you want to pronounce it, who was very deceitful, agreed to the deal and told him, you work for me, you marry her. And he tricked him. At the wedding, he switched. He didn't know until later that it was Leah. He married Leah. And we're not going to get into all the details of why didn't he divorce Leah, because he married her. So on what grounds would he divorce her? Just because he is committed to marrying her sister? So marry the sister. You can have two wives. Polygamy was permitted for everyone at that time. Either two sisters and can't be married to two sisters. That's not the law yet. That's going to be the law for the Jews. So just because you took this upon yourself to behave like a Jew and to keep all the regulations that will apply to the Jewish people, that's beautiful and commendable. But not when it conflicts with your being a Noahide. So basically, the point I want to bring out from this example is that to keep all of the laws that are beyond the requirement cannot contradict any of the seven. That's the bottom line. And usually they wouldn't. Usually they don't. You have to find such a case in order for it to be such an issue. Top of page 165. Secondly, since Noahide law is concerned with the harmonious habitation of the world, further stringencies above the baseline obligations. Again, that verse, which is the basis, the verse in Isaiah, that the world was not created for chaos, but to be proper, settled, that is the guiding force that the Noahide world needs to follow. So when it's not absolute, clear, the do's and the don'ts, because it's not one of the seven, but you want to do it in the spirit of the seven, it cannot infringe on this philosophy, this approach. Thus, for example, in capital crimes, Noahide law does not at a basic level preclude circumstantial evidence, as discussed above. That was last class. I think we spoke all about that. A society with a need to bolster basic social order may necessarily need to rely on circumstantial evidence to convict and rein in lawbreaking. So you can't become like a Jew or like the Jewish nation or follow the Jewish laws to a T when it's going to go against this. So for instance, in the Jewish world, for the most part, there must be eyewitnesses, as we discussed. And if not, can't do a thing. And even there's exceptions, but let's leave that alone. Basically, the law is the law. There weren't two kosher witnesses. The two witnesses are related. Yeah, but they're the most trustworthy people, these two brothers. They're Moses and Aaron. Doesn't matter. They can't be related. And all the requirements, they have to be over a certain age. They have to be male. They have to be. That's the way God made it. So you even have eyewitnesses. But some technicality here is off. That's it. Don't use that same baseline approach for the Noahide, because then people will be, no pun intended, getting away with murder. Now, in the Jewish world, yes, they can get away with murder, but it doesn't make sense, but it's not fair. We know clearly God's command to the Jewish people that it's a capital crime to commit murder, and yet it's almost impossible to actually implement the punishment of putting them to death. Now, without getting into what the punishment should be for the Noahide, we know it's capital punishment officially for all the seven. But whatever the case is, don't follow the Jewish law at the expense of society, if I may say it like that. Only once the society operates at a higher level of stability may it take upon itself measures limiting the recourse to circumstantial evidence and demand of itself more stringent criteria of objectivity than that afforded through circumstantial evidence when it comes to imposing severe punishments. He's not saying never. When the whole world or the country or whatever the community gets to that point, beautiful, then you can start making these adjustments. But at first, it'll be counterproductive, and you don't have the divine word of God to fall back on and say, we're just following his instructions. No, you don't have a right to say that, because it isn't so for the Noahide. The same applies to punishment. As an ultimate resort, Noahide law, as the fundamental matrix of social order, can apply the death penalty where society is in danger of collapsing through the widespread disregard of law. When society is functioning on a higher level of social order, it need not impose maximal punishments, but only what is sufficient to deter social disruption caused by violation of the Noahide law. We'll leave it for now because that could be controversial, and he's referencing it's discussed in the chapter on justice. So let's just remember that when we learn the chapter on justice, we've had it here on page 165. In other words, his argument here is that just because we know that officially the punishment for anyone who transgresses any of the Noahide laws is the death penalty, he's saying that's official, but you need not go to that extreme if that's not where society is holding at. So let's just leave that thought for now. This concept of the application of different levels within Noahide law in a manner sensitive to the actual level of social order provides a way of reconciling the two views of Noahide law that we were discussing since the beginning of this chapter. One more minimalist and the other more maximalist in their standards. In general, the basic law is that of the first opinion. And according to advance in social order, one may proceed to full or partial adoption of the second view, as have some societies in various areas of Noahide law. He doesn't reference that, and therefore I tend to say that this is his own thinking. It's very nice, and he's kind of combining or trying to minimize the argument between the two approaches. And he basically wants to say that the approach of, for instance, the first one, which would be Maimonides, the Rambam, is initially that these are the seven and need not take on others. But then once it's become pretty much established, and let's just say, so to say, that the Noahide movement has a great degree of success and the world in a very positive way has made a major shift, then Rabbi Cowen here wants to suggest that then we could allow for the second approach. All right. A final third consideration here is whether having advanced to a higher level by taking on new restrictions or obligations, society can revert from them to a lower, more basic level. The question. However, we got to that point. Let's just say we followed all of his steps. And as society, now the Noahide world is keeping, by law, lots of the Jewish code of law as far as civil laws are concerned. They're following, that's their code of law. Can they then decide we want to step down a little bit? We want to change, we want to modify, we'd like to amend and change some of the laws. Because after all, we're not Jewish and it's not originally, binding for us. There is argument as to whether the scriptural teaching which disallows this to the Jewish people, unless the court which wishes to remove the stricture is equal in stature to the one which enacted it, applies also Noahide law. So that gets into a whole other discussion. See, by Jewish law, as in most cases, it's pretty clear. I don't want to use the word simple. It's pretty clear. Very black and white. Extremely detailed and complicated, but very black and white. Meaning, the law, the Talmud, and then ultimately the code of Jewish law tells you how the system works, including the amending of laws or a rabbinic law. So let's say that the rabbis decided to make a certain restriction in order to uphold the biblical level. And they did. Without exaggerating, they made thousands of such things. There are thousands of rules that are binding for every Jew, not good suggestions, absolute law. And the purpose of them is basically to protect the people, so they not transgress. What happens if at a certain point, theoretically, after there's a certain rule that was instituted by the Jewish court. I'm talking about the Supreme Court, and back in the time when we had a Supreme Court. I'm not talking. None of this really applies today. The Sanhedrin, I'm talking about. What happens if a while later they decided, for whatever reasons, that we need to undo it? Let's ease up. Let's be more lenient in a certain area. So the rule basically is that if the later court that wants to change this situation is greater in wisdom, how do you measure that? And in number. Well, what does that mean? There's always 71 members, no more, no less. Be that as it may, if they're greater in wisdom and in number, then they may. They could change it and remove what previously was an absolute prohibition by rabbinic law. They can undo it permanently until another court decides otherwise, whatever. Now, the question is, how does it work in the Noahide world? Are they also supposed to copy that rule that the Jewish court has? That's another question. One view is that it does. Okay? And he brings down in 78 the sources. So one opinion is, yes, that's how it works. Another is that it does not, as he brings down in 79. So you got two opinions. Okay? According to the latter view, which would be Maimonides, the Rambam, a society which adopts a new obligation may not be able to reverse its standard. We're not talking about an individual or a family. We're talking about a society. They took upon themselves to legally implement certain Torah laws. Then there's no turning back. An example of such a measure might be an obligation to collect lost property without an identifiable owner and to follow procedures to find the owner. Society should not abandon its accomplishments in new levels of regard for others. So, in other words, even if you're going to take the approach that those laws don't apply to Noahides, it's not stealing. If you found something which it's not known who the loser was, you need not take it and try to find the original owner who lost it. A Jew needs to, gets very detailed, but in the case of when the Jew needs to, he needs to. And it's a commandment, it's a positive commandment, and it's a negative commandment to avoid doing it, whereas the Noahide doesn't, according to the view that they don't have to follow all of the Jewish civil laws. But if they took upon themselves to do it, then now society is doing that. There's a whole system, I'm just saying, if this were to be, that there would be a whole system of lost and found on an international level, lost and found. Then that's making it a better world, and you can't back down from that. Nevertheless, the view that a society may let go additional adopted norms is in accordance with the first view, which is the baseline opinion. As mentioned above, a stringency, such as requiring maximal levels of proof for criminal conviction, may turn out to be an unwarranted leniency when a breakdown in society order rather warrants more basic and more effective conditions for conviction. So you think you're being strict. You're actually, as is the case many times, your stringency is really a leniency in an inappropriate way. You're being lenient with the criminals. I mean, let's just, to change a little bit, but just to give a more practical example of how we can relate to it. If they decide that criminals who have been convicted for doing terrible, terrible crimes, I mean, I'm not talking white collar, really terrible, terrible people who or done terrible, terrible things, which today, for the most part, they get life sentences, which is the whole discussion for itself. What does the Torah say about that? But they get, let's say, a life sentence. Sometimes they just get a few hundred years, depending on how they combine and accumulate all the different, charges against them. So they add it all up, and sometimes they may get 500 years or whatever it is, and not life. Now, what happens? They decide, no, maximum 10 years. So that's very nice for all those people. You were really lenient, and I'm sure all of those murderers, serial killers, and rapists, etc., appreciate the fact that now the maximum that they can get is 10 years. You were really nice to them and lenient. What does that do for society? It's less of a deterrent now. Now, this twisted individual or whatever, however his sick brain is wired, hopefully knowing that there is a chance that he will be locked up for the rest of his life is a deterrent. That's part of why they're doing it. It's not just a correctional institution to make all these people into good, fine people. It's a deterrent. So you're being lenient, you're being nice, ends up being harsh or not good. So here also, the other way, being strict and keeping a very high level, meaning to say that you almost make it impossible to punish criminals, that's not good for society initially. Okay. The Ordering of Noahide Law, 167. All Noahide Law, including the 7 laws, and that which is rational in the wider revelation, and therefore also binding in Noahide Law, and other laws applicable to humanity, learned from other sources in scripture and tradition, can be set out within the framework of the 7 Noahide laws themselves. This is because the Noahide laws can be shown to cover the entire matrix of the domains of human existence, as demonstrated by the Maharal of Prague in his schema of the Noahide laws set out in chapter 3. Before we go further, in other words, it's not that God created the world and created mankind and chose his favorite nation, the Jewish people, and gave them lots and lots of commandments, hundreds of do's and don'ts. Now, what about the rest of the world? Here's 7 rules. 7? That's it. And then what about the rest of our lives? How do we conduct ourselves? Makes no difference. You're irrelevant. So to say, God doesn't give a hoot. That's not, I don't think that's fair to say that any of the commentaries say that. Either of the 2 schools. Not just, oh, here's 7 laws, so just keep these 7. You didn't kill, you didn't steal, you're up. Okay, but you can lead any life. No, because included in these 7, such as the prohibition of idolatry, is the idea of believing in God, having a relationship with God, and so forth. So it's all about making this a better world, and the human race is supposed to be running and making this God's world. There's a purpose. As indicated in part 1, there are a variety of ways and perspectives through which to order and conceptually understand the Noahide laws. This was the theory part all the way at the beginning. The order in which part 2 of this book chooses to set out the concrete practice of the Noahide laws starts with the Noahide laws in the personal dimension. That is to say, the laws between the human being and God, which morally constitute the individual. First, he said, belief in God is logically the basis of the authority for all the other Noahide laws as divinely given laws. Remember, we keep on quoting what Maimonides says, that if a non-Jew is keeping the seven just because logically they make sense, but not because he is commanded to do so by God, that's better than not, but that's not the ultimate. That's not what we're really striving to get to. So we really want it to be a God-given law that the individual recognizes, and once you have that, now you've accepted the authority of the creator, of the commander. Now the details can fall into place. This is followed by the related precept of the reverence for God, because that's one of the seven. And then by the Noahide law relating to human sexuality, which also morally defines personal human identity. That'll be the second thing of what he's going to deal with. Next are treated the interpersonal Noahide laws, which organize and relate individuals to each other as members of society. The Noahide laws relating to justice, killing and theft, and material harm. These are followed by discussion of the Noahide law, which deals with the way in which individuals and society should act in the treatment of nature. That would be Eva Minachai, how to refrain from ripping apart pieces of a living being before the animal is properly killed. So that's the order of how he's going to deal with it. Within each of the areas of the seven Noahide laws, this work sets out both the basic law, which is generally in accordance with the first or minimalist view, where there is no contrary adjectation in the tradition from Sinai, which basically is the Cowen, the Maimonides approach. It also sets out, where applicable, the further scope for conduct under the second maximalistic opinion found in Noahide law, which would be basically the chinuch approach of the Sefer HaChinuch. So he's not absolutely sticking to one, but as he said, starting off in one way, and then gradually, when society seems to have progressed and come to a good place, then we'll incorporate the other. All right, so that's the end of this chapter. And as you see, he just told us what the order is going to be when dealing with all of the seven. So the next chapter is going to be dealing all about the individual's belief and relationship to God and all that. And then after that, he's going to go in the order that he just mentioned. This is a good place to stop. And we will, with the help of Hashem, continue next class from chapter 7, Belief in God. Right now, we're going to open the floor for comments, questions, you name it, please.
So Rabbi Cowen is suggesting that as a society or as a person or society improves, refines, becomes a better person or better society, then the other laws can start to make sense for them.
Yeah,
and that's largely in the area of mishpat.
Yeah, and it's not either this or that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a progressional thing. So in other words, it's not that he's taking the maximalistic approach. Clearly is not. But he's not completely negating that either. So in other words, let's speak right now for an individual. So many of you observant Noachites, B'nai Noach. So you want to do more and more. You want to have a relationship with Hashem. So again, within the guidelines, and as long as it doesn't contradict everything that we learned about today, very good. You can, as long as, like we had previously, all the exceptions, what you can't do. You have a whole bunch of mitzvahs that you can't do, but otherwise, sure, why not? But that doesn't mean that everybody should be on the same page that you are. This is where you're holding right now, because you have a certain understanding and a certain relationship with Hashem. You've been immersed and involved in the world of the Noahide for as much time as each individual, and therefore this is where you're at, or this is where you and your family are at. That's great. That doesn't mean that, on the one hand, anyone who's not observing the same additional commandments that you are is doing anything wrong. And it also doesn't mean that anyone who's, so to say, more extreme or more observant than you are is going beyond. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't aspire to get to a higher place. But you have to know your place and when and where it's appropriate. And practically speaking, which this can really open up a whole discussion, and this would apply to Jews as well, but especially in this context for the Noahites, what do you do when it interferes with your family, your social life, your friends, or your business? In other words, you have to keep the 7 laws, nothing to discuss in all their detail. But what happens if your extra, if I may, religiosity is infringing on any of the above? Well, then that's a different story. It's something serious to consider. And that would, so to say, be comparable to the case of Jacob, where he ended up having to marry 2 sisters against his personal religious observance, because he had no right to keep that commandment in that given situation. So there's countless examples. I'm sure you guys can mention so many examples. Let's say it's a person's parents that are making certain demands, or a person's spouse is not holding where you are, and he or she doesn't appreciate whatever it may be. Let's just make up an example. A Noahide decides to go to synagogue every Shabbos morning. Goes there every Shabbos morning, gets inspired. He knows he's not Jewish. He doesn't get called up to the Torah. Of course. They don't count him as the 10th man. But he comes there and he prays to Hashem. And prayer is definitely one of those things that is in the list that you should do. Okay? And it's not appreciated. Not that his spouse says you should go to church. No, they get that. They don't do that. But they say, why are you going to synagogue every Shabbos? So if it were a Jewish couple where, let's say, the man is going to synagogue every Shabbos morning, every Saturday, and the wife is objecting, okay, that should not be taken lightly. But if I may, let me generalize or give a stereotype verdict. At the end of the whole discussion, and again, this is not fair because every case is different and you have to take in all the factors and all the considerations, but in general, the end of that discussion would be that the authority, the rabbi, whoever, would end up telling that couple that the man is doing what's right and he should continue to go to synagogue every Shabbos morning, and somehow we have to make it work in their marriage. Now let's shift. It's a Noahide couple. They're both non-Jewish, and he or she, one of them, really enjoys going to synagogue, and it helps their spiritual growth, etc., etc. And it just isn't the same when they don't go. A week that they miss going, they don't feel so connected, etc., etc. And they really, really, really want to go to synagogue. They know they don't have to, but they really want to do this mitzvah, if you will, and their spouse is strongly objecting or is uncomfortable. And again, you have to take in all the factors and everything, but to generalize, probably the ruling in that case would be, don't go to synagogue every Shabbos. It's harming your marriage. Let's figure out how you can still have the same, or a similar spiritual growth, whatever the case is, but don't go. So that's just one example. It may not even be such a good example, but I'm just trying to think in practical terms. But there's so many examples where, let's take it even to a higher plane. You want to be a positive influence on the rest of the world, on the people that you interact with, on your neighbors and friends. And if becoming more observant in a Jewish way is going to distance you socially from your friends, neighbors, relatives, whatever, then you need to ask yourself, is the world, is God gaining by my personal observance and growth more than if I would be more of a direct influence on others by simply interacting with them and not having such a distance or whatever? And just, that's the gist of it.
One thing that sometimes comes up in Noahide groups, Noahide questions, what about holiday? If family, the parents have a tradition of coming together on a certain day, they're not doing it as a religious thing, they're doing it as a family thing, but Noahides want to know, should they do that? Whereas a Jew would not be allowed to do that. Would it be proper for a Noahide to be part of the family?
Is it a pagan holiday, or is it just something like?
Well, it's traditionally something like a Christmas Day.
Uh-huh.
Whereas but let's say the family gets together, they're not going to church, not worshiping anything, but they're having a family get together, winter festival type of thing.
I would say that would be a technical question,
mm-hmm.
And that even though in the spirit of the law you want to stay away from it, but because families getting together, so I would say that needs to be asked by an authority, such as Rabbi Moshe Weiner, or someone who knows the Noahide laws but really well, a halachic authoritative rabbi in that area. And if it's permitted, even though in general you don't want to go that direction, you should. And if it's not allowed, then it's not allowed. We don't talk about it. Jews have these types of questions all the time. For example, if there is a relative's wedding that's not a kosher wedding, so the Jew wants to know if they can go participate or not. So even though to begin with, it would never go to such a wedding, but because of the sensitivity involved, it's a relative, and it could harm the harmony of the home, etc. So they ask the authority, the rabbi, and if it's permissible, then in that case, the person would go against their comfort zone and go. And if it's not allowed at the end of the day, then try to be nice about it, try to apologize. It may not work, may take time for the damage or harm, quote unquote, for them to get over it. But, if you can't do something, you can't do something. That's the bottom line. All right, anyone else? All right, so I think that that's it for today's class, and looking forward to seeing all of you with the help of Hashem in 2 weeks' time. That would be what did we say, June 20th, Thursday, the 20th of June, Belina there with the help of Hashem. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All the best.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Very well.
Yeah, good evening.